All right, we're going to be picking up on chapter 16 here in the 15th book of Yisrayl, Righteousness Prevails. And, of course, this is one here. And the title is, The World is Filled with Sickness and Disease, Hatred and Wars, but it's going to be changed by Yahweh's last day's work to peace. So this is the state that it's in, and it's going to be changed to peace. Now, we endure a lot of things right now. We've got, there's a lot of sickness going around. We have sickness just from, I don't know if this warm air kind of blew in some microbes that came from the south. Now, we're not, blaming our brothers in the south or anything like that, but it seems like sometimes when you get these warm breezes that come in, I think it might be more like pollen or something that comes in, but I don't know about you if you had experience this week, but man, my allergies were just, they were horrible this week. I don't know what it was. I'm appreciative of the warm weather, but when we think about just simple things like that with allergies and the sicknesses that we have to endure and we go through, this should it should draw to our attention the importance of understanding and learning the laws of Yahweh. As we see in this title here, this is the current state of this world. It's filled with sickness, it's filled with disease, it's filled with hatred and wars. And as Yeshua talked about in Matthew chapter 24, the abounding, the superabundance, because iniquity will abound. And we see this all throughout the world. We see this coming forth from the churches. We see it coming forth from of course, the religious leaders. We see it coming forth from the secular leaders as well. Everyone is guided by some form of religion in some way. In the United States government and in most governments, in some way, religion plays a role in that. The kings of the earth guide and have their powers, their tentacles, in every aspect of life. And because the laws of Yahweh have been rejected for so long, 6,000 years, a little over 6,000 years now, we see that the microorganisms that Yahweh has given us to protect us, to provide food for us, to keep the air clean for us and everything, they are not able to do their jobs, And as a result, our bodies aren't as healthy as they should be, because where do we draw our life from? We draw our resources from the earth. We draw our resources from the air. Of course, yes, we do receive life from Yahweh. That's what gives us life, the breath of life. But also what we eat, what we drink, what we breathe, and so forth, that comes forth from the firmament and the kingdoms of the dust of the earth. And if you remember in Genesis, if you have your Holy Scriptures, I know it's not that cold today, but man, I am freezing. I'm praise Yahweh, these talits are linen. I bet you in Israel you probably find some thermal linen, thermal talits. But let's see, in Genesis chapter 1, now this was given to mankind here. Of course, mankind wasn't created till the sixth day of the creation of Yahweh. But in verse 26 it says, Then Yahweh said, I will make man in my image according to my likeness. Of course, we know the history of this. And they will have rulership over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And of course, this was explained to us. The definitions in the words show that it's over everything with which the earth creeps. The kingdoms of the dust of the earth, that's what we're going to have power over one day, and that's what we're going to be controlling. Everything from the wind. You remember the examples that was shown with Yeshua Messiah, how he was able to inspire a fish, command a fish to go and get a coin and bring it back so that the apostles could pay their taxes. How he walked on water. How Kepha actually walked on water for a time period until he started to doubt, and the microorganisms knew that, and however that worked out, I don't know. We'll find out one day. And then he started to sink. How the wind subsided by his command. Everybody else was freaking out about it. The boat was being tossed all over the place, but Yeshua just gave a command, and the wind was silent. These are the microorganisms in the firmament that we're going to have control over one day. But remember, how they're going to listen to us, what's going to give us that authority over them, and what's going to cause them to yield to us is righteousness. We will have to prove ourselves. Right now is our training time. Right now is the proving time. But we will have to prove ourselves worthy so that these microorganisms will say, yes, that's one that can be trusted. That's one I will listen to. Like Yeshua did when he was on earth. They trusted him, and they knew that he was someone who wasn't going to use them to bring death, destruction, sickness, disease, and so forth on earth, or even to themselves. So let's get going here. This is a sermon dated 5/30/15, and we're on page 172. And if you look at verse 2, it says, Pastor says, it looks like nuclear war. It looks like nuclear war pretty soon. They're certainly trying to coax everyone into it. You can see trouble everywhere now, pretty much all over the globe. Now, this sermon was given, it was a year ago, a little less than a year ago, 5/30. We're in the first Roman month here. And we're seeing the same thing. If you look at the news and you see what's taking place, it's like tit for tat, between the United States and Russia. They're calling this a new Cold War, except it seems like it's a lot worse than what it used to be. What they say, 7,300 nuclear warheads that Russia has, compared to the United States, 7,100. So between the two of them, what is that? 14,400 warheads. And the United States kind of wants to get a jump on Russia. How many warheads do you think it's really going to take to destroy a country? 7,000? There's not even that many countries on this earth, but we've got to get just a few more hundred higher than our neighbor so that we can have peace. And this is the mindset, the thinking, the mentality of our leaders and of these nations, which, of course, remember, it's a three-way battle that you have between the United States, Russia, and the Vatican, and of course the Vatican hopes to win out. So if you are in a three-way war between two other people, in order for you to win out without looking like the bad guy, what is the best strategy that you think you should take? Pit the two against one another. And then after they destroy themselves, well, I guess since there's nobody else, I'll go pick up the pieces. And that's what the Vatican, the Pope is just the spokesman, but the Vatican hopes to win out. That's what Mary hopes to win out. She's the one that's inspiring and guiding them, but we know that her time is drawing near, and she is going down. She dying, she will die. Just like what Yahweh told to mankind, it's the same thing with her. In verse 3 it says, the house of Yahweh is pretty much all over the globe too. Praise Yahweh. I'd like for you to make a note to yourself and try to enroll in the classes. Of course, he was talking about the character education classes. But the point here in this particular verse I wanted you to take a look at here is he says the house of Yahweh is pretty much all over the globe too. I don't know how many of you remember. Let me see. I came in 92. We found out about the house in 91. My wife was even before then, like in 80-something, 80, 86, 88 or something like that. And I remember when we first found out about the house of Yahweh, the extent of the outreach, so to speak, was, of course, what we passed out with our hands. And then I think there were a few radio stations that the House of Yahweh broadcast to or submitted programs to. And, of course, over the years, it started to expand and extend. I know a lot of you have probably been a part of the public access, right? Everybody remember public access, taking the tapes and then the CDs to the cable stations to spread the message, the prophetic word magazines out from there, and then it spread even more so. We've got the satellite program, and we got the internet, and little by little, as Daniel foretold in chapter 12 that technology would increase, so has the house of Yahweh's ability to reach the nations increased as well. And as a result, we have been bringing forth or fulfilling this prophecy in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, which says that this message must go out to all the world, before the end comes. And of course, it's going out by the one who is ordained to bring it forth. If you look at, let's see here, Zechariah as well. Well, just write down for your notes. Just write down for your notes. Zechariah chapter 5, verse 9 and 11 talks about the same thing of this message going out. And of course, Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, it also refers to the house of Yahweh and the great work which will be done. But this has to go out. Why does it have to go out? Why does the house of Yahweh pretty much have to go over all the globe? Because we have to give mankind a warning. Remember in Yeketskiah what it talks about? Son of man, if you see the wicked sinning, then you must warn them. We must warn them. We must show them their sins. We must tell them what they're doing and what they're bringing upon themselves. Because remember, it's always foretold by the house of Yahweh first. But then it is our responsibility to point them in the right direction, to point them toward the law, to point them toward the light of Yahweh's law, so that if Yahweh is calling them out, and of course this is how we know Yahweh is calling a person out, they have to have the message preached to them. That's that spirit of calling. And of course, in order to seek the house, you have to know that the house of Yahweh is the place bringing forth the message, the laws of Yahweh, and so forth. So that has to be going out so a person can start to look for those things. But in having this message go out, we're reaching the world, reaching this last remnant of people who will come to the house and actually join you, each and every one of you, in this great training program of the laws of Yahweh. And then from there, of course, praise Yahweh, we will start to clean up the earth. But remember, we're going to have a front row seat as we see these wars. We're seeing the sicknesses, we're seeing the diseases, we're seeing the hatred and wars, we're seeing the global weather patterns and how they've been changed and how they've been a very extreme. Everybody, if you've seen the news this last week about California, they've been experiencing some heavy flooding in those areas. They were under some extreme drought for a long time. I think, let's see, was it Lake Mead? They rose a foot. It rose a foot, I guess I should say, after all this rain, and that's equivalent to, I can't remember, so many billions of gallons of water, and it was at 97-something% drought stage. Now they're saying it's about 60 or so. But even if California was to be at zero drought phase, it wouldn't fix all their problems. Let's look over here to verse 4. Let's see. Oh, no. He's talking a little bit more about the class there. Come over here to verse 11. Verse 10, back up to verse 10. It says, President Obama, he's pushing for peace, and we can see that in his newsletters, but he had a breakfast meeting, and he talked about the Crusades. And these Crusades, he doesn't know what you know, what we've brought out, and what is easy to find in the Yisrayl Says program. He doesn't realize where the Crusades started and what is causing them, but in his remarks, and I want to read you just a little bit of this to bring you up to date. Pastor says, don't forget where we left off and what we're speaking of in these last days when Babylon is going to fall. And of course, Revelation chapter 18 talks about that. And this is something, and if you just hold that thought right there, we'll just go back to move forward, I guess, to Revelations. Revelations chapter 18. But in verse 3 it says, in verse 2 it says, and he cried mightily with a loud voice. This is the Malach here that's given to do these things, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of demons, and the hole of every foul spirit, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Now notice, all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The wine, that is these teachings that are coming forth, the same thing that Yeshua was talking about that was causing this iniquity to abound. People have to be taught to ignore the laws. People have to be taught to ignore instructions that will bring them health, that will bring them peace, that will bring them abundant living. You think a person would be an idiot to reject those types of things. But remember, the gods of this world have blinded the minds of the people so that they don't understand, so they don't see the truth. So they have to be taught this. Otherwise, they would see Yahweh and see His laws, and they would repent and be converted and live. But it's become this cage of every unclean and hateful bird, for all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich through the abundance of her delicacies. Now notice in verse 4 he says, and I heard a voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. Now the people of Yahweh, if you remember in Chronicles chapter 7, I believe it's around verse 14, it was the great King Solomon was giving this prayer, and he was saying, if my people who are called with my name will humble themselves and pray, and turn from their sins, and of course Yahweh says, I will hear from heaven, I will heal their sins, I will heal their land, and so forth, and they'll have the peace, joy, and abundant living. But my people, this is a command to us. We have to come out of this world so we do not partake of her sins, so that we do not receive of her plagues. Why? Because her sins have reached unto heaven, and Yahweh has remembered her iniquities. And of course, coming out of the world, we have to be mindful. We just had the laws read to us during the Feast of Tabernacles there. And, that is a great resource. That is a great strength to each and every one of us. You think about it, the people in the world right now, they really have no hope. The only thing that they hope for pretty much is that they make retirement age so they can get a pension and just sit back and eventually they'll die. That's pretty much it. I mean, they have no hope, no goals, no aspiration, no motivation for anything except I talked to a man who was he was a state trooper. This was out west Texas, but and I was like, yeah, you enjoy your job? You like, doing this job, because, a lot of young boys, I want to be a police officer, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a garbage man, So I don't know, I figured maybe it's filling one of his lifelong dreams. And I said, is it exciting? You like it? He's like, no, I hate it. I said, you hate it? I was like, yeah, I'm just doing this for the pension. I said, doing it for the pension? Really? I said, how long you got to go for your pension? He said, I think you got to, I can't remember. I might be wrong, so don't quote me on this, but it was something like 15 or 20 years or something like that, and he was only like 2 years into it, And I'm like, wow, you're going to stick it out that long just to get a pension? Hopefully you don't get shot by that time. And I'm thinking, how miserable that is. I mean, people just go to work just picking the lesser of the two evils that they have set before them. But in the house of Yahweh, we actually have motivation. We have goals. We have aspirations and desires. We have something to look forward to. We have a great kingdom that we're training for, and we have to keep our mind on the goal, like the series of sermons says, keep the goal in sight, because, you're not going to be, swinging a hammer or working on a car or running pipe or hanging from electrical lines or whatever it is you're doing now. It's a part of your training to build your character so that you can be used in the capacity that Yahweh has called you to be used for. That is, learning the laws, as we have in the banner over here, learning what to teach so that we can teach what we've learned. And the main thing is, that the greatest power, the greatest ability that we have set before us is actually being able to bring peace. Being able to bring true peace and health to another individual. No one in the world right now, in all their great wisdom and all their great technology and all their great power and resources, can do it. The only way that they feel that they can accomplish it is to destroy what they call their enemy. But they don't even know why that person's their enemy. But remember what Yahweh's laws do. They make friends out of enemies. In verse 11 here it says, don't forget where we left off. Let's see here. Yeah, don't forget where we left off and what we're speaking of in these last days when Babylon is going to fall. And as the apostles said, she'll proceed no longer because we're taking it down step by step. The people are already falling away from the Christian churches. They're leaving them, and at least 2 billion people who are left alive will come here. Nuclear war is coming. The last 2 billion people who are left alive, they're going to be kept alive by Yahweh, and they will be brought here to the house of Yahweh. Just like each and every one of us, if we think back, most of us, the older of us men, who before the house of Yahweh, who actually lived in the world before the house of Yahweh, I'm sure we can think of many times of stupidity in our lives where our life could have easily ended or gone another way. But Yahweh preserved our lives. He preserved us, as it shows in Job 33, from going to the grave because he has a work for us. But don't go back to the ways of the world. Don't go back to God worship. Put away, all things which defile. Put away the things which are influences that cause you to turn your mind, turn your heart from Yahweh. These are the things that the law tells us not to seek the ways of the gods. Don't take on the image or the likeness of the gods. And everything in the world right now is in that image and likeness. In verse 12, he says, now, over the last few months, Barack Obama's speech, we've seen a number of challenges, certainly over the last 6 years. But part of what I want to touch on today is the degree to which we've seen professions of faith. That is, Pastor says, religions, and this is the same way the Scripture speaks of it too, and I was surprised that he used the word that way. But this word faith in the Scripture means the whole religious system, including Yahweh's tree of righteousness versus the tree of righteousness and evil, or the evil that was actually added to Yahweh's way. And that's that mixture that Yahweh warns against, because when we add to, or when a person adds to the law of Yahweh, or they take something out of the law of Yahweh. Now, of course, you can't change the law of Yahweh, but you can eliminate what's available to the person, or you can put an interpretation on the law, like you have with the Talmud and things like that, the Babylonian Talmud, the confusing Talmud. And you can make it so that the person who is receiving the law now has a distorted picture of the moral code or the rules that Yahweh wants a person to live by, so that they can become like Yahweh. And so as a result, when that is altered, when the law is altered, it's like the recipe. Figure the law as a recipe for perfection. The law is a recipe for righteousness. The law is a recipe for health, peace, joy, abundant living. Yes, even wealth, success, and everything that you put your hands to do, like Yahweh shows in the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy, chapter 1 through 14. But like a recipe, when we add something to what was already perfect, we alter it, we change it. And when we take something away from it, again, we alter it and we change it. So now it's not going to produce the effect that it was designed originally by the perfect cook, if you want to look at it that way, to do. So that's why we can't add to or take away from the law of Yahweh, because we actually, like Yeshua said in Revelations, we will take our part out of the book of Yahweh, or the book of life. But it's this whole system, the religious system, including Yahweh's tree of life, tree of righteousness versus the tree of righteousness and evil, or the evil that was actually added to it. He says, professions of faith used both as an instrument of great good, but also twisted and misused in the name of evil. Now, if we go back over here to page 174 and verse 15, because he's talking about some of the things that are going on throughout the world. That is, President Barack Obama was talking about some of the things that were going on throughout the world, the fighting amongst religions and the fighting against religions. We had the Yazidis who were, they were taken captive, different sects of different faiths. Of course, a lot of it was in the Muslim faith, but you have it taking place not only in the Middle East. That's where we see it taking place a lot. It was a huge thing taking place in what was it, Scotland and Ireland or something like that, with the Catholics and the Protestants. I mean, there was the horrible warring and factions taking place there as well. In verse 15 it says, of course, if you read the history of these crusades, they burnt many of them to death. That is, they burnt many of the people who were holding on to a little bit of righteousness. They burnt them to death. In fact, the word crusade here, the word crusade actually simply means, as a noun, any of the military expeditions undertaken by the Christians of Europe in the, now they say 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, for the recovery of the Holy Land from the Muslims. That's one of their definitions there. Another definition is any war carried under papal sanction. And also it says here, any vigorous, aggressive movement for the defense or advancement of an idea, cause, etc. Of course, they have an example of crusade against child abuse. And that's why the Catholic churches, that's why the Cain killed Abel, cause he didn't like righteousness. You know, they didn't like the teachings of the laws of Yahweh. They say the first crusade started back here in the 1100s and so forth. No, Cain had a crusade against Abel, 6,000 something years ago, almost 6,000 something years ago, because Abel was standing up for righteousness and telling Cain, actually, just like Yochanan told the king, Herod, it's not right that you have your brother's wife. And what did they do to Yochanan? The same thing they did to Abel. And they fight against any form of holiness and righteousness. In fact, the etymology of the word crusade is from Middle French, and it actually tells you to look at the word cross. Cross. By this you shall conquer. Remember what that upside down sword looked like there. The cross. So he says here, they hung some of their crosses on the stakes, which is a miserable way of dying, and it lasts for hours and hours and hours. And because they burnt the people alive on the stake, and it is a terrible. I see why David said, Yahweh, you decide the judgment for me, but just don't let me fall into the hands of man, because the kindest, tenderest mercies of mankind are evil. They would burn their neighbor at the stake. We've seen some of the things on the news that have been done in the name of holiness, quote unquote. They condemn everything that is righteous, if you notice, but they will stand up and say, this was a good thing. And that's what it was. It was a God thing, an evil God thing that they were doing to people who would keep the Sabbath day, own a menorah, be caught cooking food in advance on the seventh day of the week. And for any of these things, they would arrest you. They would send the police out and arrest these people. And of course, the house of Yahweh, we have this protection, but, men, we have to be very careful that we don't cut ourselves off from Yahweh by returning to sin in any way, so that we'll see these things take place, as the scripture says, 1,000 at your right hand and 10,000 at your left, but it will not come near you. And of course, Yahweh does assure us that in practicing these laws, we'll be able to stand by His side, not directly by Yahweh, but by the side of the one who is our head and teacher, and put an end to all of this suffering, because we'll be the only ones teaching the laws of Yahweh. And of course, it'll spread from there. May Yahweh bless your understanding. If you all please stand. Turn it over to the Great Khan Levi.
Shalom, everyone. Please be seated. So we're continuing in the 15th book of Israel. We're in chapter 16, and this sermon was given 5/30/2015. And I'd like to pick up from verse 22, continuing in the sermon where the great priest left off, talking about the Crusades. And in this sermon here, Pastor is giving the history of the children of Israel, especially as we'll go through it. You'll see a lot of what took place in Exodus and Numbers, and coming down to today with the Vatican being in control of of the world at this time, who were leading the kings of the earth. Now in verse 22, we read that when they chose a king instead of Yahweh, Samuel told them what was going to take place. Had they have chosen to follow Yahweh, Yahweh would have fought any battles for them, and he proved that. He proved that when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, that should have been enough to have taught them at that time. In 1 Samuel even, they didn't have to lift a hand, and their enemies were defeated. Now notice what Pastor says here in verse 23. Now you need to believe that, because if you don't trust in Yahweh, like I'm telling you, you have got to, you won't make it through this great ordeal that is taking place in this last period, where the very elect, if it were possible, they would bring deception to the very elect. And you know who that is. And if you don't put your stock in Yahweh and be willing to go the full 9 yards and be willing to trust in Yahweh, if you run, you're going to lose your life. Not only that, your eternal life. Let's look at Matthew chapter 24, verse 12. Because this is where our mind should be at in the house of Yahweh, that we are going to remain in the house of Yahweh forever. Of course, forever begins from the time that you are baptized, and it continues on, and there's no end as long as you're determined to uphold the laws of Yahweh. Now in Matthew chapter 24 it says, but he who endures until the end, the same will be saved, or have that salvation. And this endurance, if you were to look up the word endure in Thayer's Greek English lexicon, it means to remain, therefore abide, not recede or flee. This word recede is talking about drawing back. So when we endure in the house of Yahweh, once we have put our hands to the plow, there is no looking back, there's no taking the hand out of the plow, off the plow. There's no receding or looking back to the world. In Strong's, this word means to remain. Strong's Greek English lexicon, it means to remain, figuratively to undergo, that is, bear trials, have fortitude, and persevere. Of course, this is part of what we do in the house of Yahweh. We go through trials, and as we go through those trials, we have to have fortitude. And that word fortitude means strength. We have to rely on the strength of Yahweh, which gives us that fortitude, and it allows us also to persevere. Just on a note, the last Feast of Tabernacles was truly an awesome feast. And, personally, I was involved in doing a lot of chores, as Pastor calls it. So there were many services that was missed as a result of getting certain things done. And after the feast was over, and maybe a month or so after, the sermons became available to where I could listen to all the presentations, the sermons, the women's presentation, the men's presentation that was given throughout the feast. And it was very rewarding to listen to all the messages that was brought forward. And I was thinking about how many of us don't put forth the effort to really get the teachings that we may have missed because of certain duties, certain responsibilities that we may have, and so forth. But when we don't put forth the effort to get those teachings, we are depriving ourselves of the strength of Yahweh. We are depriving ourselves the fortitude that is needed to endure. Because that's where the strength comes from. The strength comes from the teachings. It comes from the message. But if we don't take it, if we don't feed ourselves, then we wouldn't have any strength to stand up to the things or to deal with the things that we have to deal with appropriately on a daily basis. So we don't have an excuse. We can't say, well, I was too busy doing the work. My duties took me away, so that's the reason why I didn't hear the message. Now, that may be the reason why, but what about after? When it becomes available? What excuse would any of us have then? Or when it's online, where you could listen to it? So there's no reason for us to deprive ourselves of the teachings of the house of Yahweh, regardless of how busy we may be during the feast, regardless of our schedules, regardless of our duties. we still have an obligation to feed ourselves this righteousness. We have to feed ourselves this righteousness. Now look at another scripture here in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, because Pastor said that if you run, you're going to lose your life. Not only that, your eternal life. And Yeshua made this very clear in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28. Chapter 10, verse 28, he says, "And do not fear those who kill the body, but are not able to kill the spirit, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both spirit and body in Gehenna." So we have that obligation to stand firm, but what we stand firm on is the strength of Yahweh. The strength of Yahweh is the teachings that comes forth from the house of Yahweh. Let's look at Romans chapter 1. We're going to be looking at a lot of scriptures simply because this is a very short sermon. So if I just read it out, we'll be done in about 10 minutes. But in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, it says, "For I'm not ashamed of the message, for it is the strength of Yahweh unto life everlasting for everyone who believes." So this is the strength. The teachings that come forth from the house of Yahweh is the strength of Yahweh. And this is what allows us to endure. This is what allows us to persevere. This is what gives us the fortitude to do the right thing day after day after day, regardless of the circumstances that we have to perform righteousness. And it's very important that we do perform righteousness because that is what's going to allow us to enter into the kingdom. Now, let's look at Yekitziot chapter 14, speaking of righteousness, because we are only going to enter in based upon not our brother's righteousness, not on our neighbor's righteousness, but our own righteousness. And if you just hold your place right there in Yekitziot chapter 14, just to reiterate what righteousness is. Anyone know what scripture I'm about to read? Exactly, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 25. Because that tells us what righteousness is. So in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 25, and it says, "And it will be our righteousness if we observe to do all of this law before Yahweh our Father as he has commanded us." So going back to Yekitziot chapter 14, let's look at verse 12. "The word of Yahweh came again to me, saying, Son of man, when the sins of the earth have reached their peak, their full measure, I will stretch out my hand against it. I will cut off its supply of bread, send famine upon it, and cut off man and beast from it. Though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver only themselves by their righteousness, says Father Yahweh." So these are three very righteous men whom have qualified for the kingdom of Yahweh based upon the testimonies that we have. But notice whom they would deliver: only themselves by their keeping the laws of Yahweh. "When I caused the evil beastly governmental system to pass through the land, and they desolate it so that it is devastated, that no man may pass through because of the evil beastly system. Though these three men were in it, as surely as I live, says Father Yahweh, they would deliver neither sons nor daughters. They only would be delivered, and the land would be desolated." So you can see even their own children, they wouldn't be able to deliver. They could only deliver themselves by their practice of righteousness. And that's the way it is with each of us in the house of Yahweh. We can only deliver ourselves by our practice of righteousness. We don't have any excuse to say, well, the only reason I couldn't do this is because my brother did so-and-so, or my wife did so-and-so, my son did so-and-so, my daughter did so-and-so, my supervisor did so-and-so. That's not going to matter. The question you are going to be asked is, well, what about you and your practice of righteousness? What did you do? This is the account that we will all have to give for ourselves. Verse 17, "Or if I bring a sword upon the land, and say, Sword, go through the land, so that I cut off man and beast from it, though these three men were in it, as surely as I live, says Father Yahweh, they would deliver neither son nor daughters, but only they would be delivered. Or when I send a pestilence into that land and poured my fury upon it in blood to cut off from it man and beast." Of course, Yahweh is not that angry God that Christianity like to paint. This is something that mankind bring upon himself. Though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, surely as I live, says Father Yahweh, they will deliver neither son nor daughter, but they will deliver their own lives by their righteousness, by their keeping of the laws of Yahweh. And so it is with us in the house of Yahweh at this time. So yes, we have to be righteous, but we also need to ensure that we are keeping up with the teachings of the house of Yahweh, that we don't neglect what is being offered to us because of the duties or the responsibilities that we may have in taking care of the many chores that needs to be done in this great house. But at the same time, we do have a responsibility to ourselves. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11 of 1 Timothy. It says, "Command and teach these things. Let no man despise your youth, but be an example to the believers in word, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, and in purity. Until I come," notice what verse 13 says, "give attention to" what? What's that next word there? Reading. Until I come, give attention to reading, to exhortation, to the teachings. So this is an obligation that we all have in the house of Yahweh. We have to give attention to the reading, to the exhortation, to the teachings. Do not neglect the gift that is in you. So this is also, we are being told what to do and what not to do. Don't neglect the gift that is in you. Don't lose sight of why you're in the house of Yahweh, why you're here, for what purpose. As Yeshua said in Matthew 6:33, to seek you first the kingdom of Yahweh. Do not neglect the gift that is in you, which was given to you through prophecy, with laying on of the hands of the body of elders. Set your love upon these things. Give yourself completely to them, that your progress may be evident to all, so that anyone looking at you could see that you are progressing in righteousness, in keeping the laws of Yahweh, that you're moving forward and upholding and keeping the laws of Yahweh. In other words, you're overcoming. That's what everyone should be seeing when they look at you as an individual in the house of Yahweh, that you're making progress in righteousness. Verse 16, pay attention to yourself and to the doctrines. Now, it didn't say pay attention to your neighbor and what your neighbor is doing, in the sense of to gossip about your neighbor and to slander and to backbite and to tail-bearing and all these things that we are told not to do. It says pay attention to yourself and to the doctrines, continue in them, for in doing this you will save both yourself and those who hear you, because they will be hearing righteous reminders coming forth from you, because you are paying attention to yourself and to the doctrines. So let's continue on here, and there are many more scriptures that could be brought in concerning what we have covered so far. But this is what Pastor is saying, that we have to put our full trust in Yahweh in verse 23, and we have to go the distance, be willing to go the full 9 yards until it's all said and done. That's the, we have to be willing to go the entire distance here. Let's continue on in chapter 24, because Pastor starts, not chapter 24, but verse 24, he's talking about the Catholic Church, and the previous teacher mentioned about the Crusades. So he's continuing on talking about the atrocities, showing that it was Yada, the tribe of Yada, that has the scepter, and they brought forth the Crusades, and the Catholic Church today is the Aaronic priesthood. If you look at the last 2 lines in verse 24, it says, the keys of this blood, the last 3 lines or 4 lines, it says, the keys of this blood show that the Catholic Church was the Aaronic priesthood that now holds the position of lawgiver. So we see that this is what they're doing. They are the lawgiver today. And of course, you could go back to Genesis 49 that talks about it. Now, Pastor has given us the history here, and I want everyone to really let this history come alive in your mind, because what Pastor is showing us is not what you would find in Christianity concerning the 12 tribes and the plan of Yahweh, how Yahweh is bringing everything together and how he foretold it in advance through prophecy and so forth. So it's really, really interesting, this history that Pastor is giving us of how these events actually transpired and how what took place thousands of years ago, how it has come down to these last days. That's why anytime he turns to Genesis chapter 49, he says, look at that verse 1 and look at those last 3 words there, in the last days. Because you have to make that connection that what we are seeing here in the end had a beginning in the very beginning, in the book of Genesis. So it's all being shown to us so that we could understand, so that we wouldn't do the same things that they did, and we will be able to turn and be able to guide and teach others righteousness. So continuing on here, we see that the Catholic Church in verse 25, it weakened itself from within, brought plagues upon themselves, and killed thousands and thousands of them. And that was the period of time that was known as when they had the Black Plague or the Black Death or the bubonic plague and so forth. Now, if you look at verse 27, well, the scepter, he says in verse 10, the scepter will not depart from Yada, nor the ruling staff. That is, a ruling staff will not depart from Yada, from between his feet until he comes. Speaking of Yeshua now, to whom tribute belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. But he hasn't taken that over. So Yeshua hasn't taken over the nations at this time. He is judge only over the house of Yahweh at this time. He is not praying for the world. He is not praying for anyone. He is not even fighting the cause of anyone except the house of Yahweh at this time. So that's Yeshua's role. Yeshua is high priest over the house of Yahweh. Now, if someone belongs to the Church of God, the Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses, and you could just start listing off one after the other. If it's not the house of Yahweh, then they're not connected to Yeshua, the high priest. That's what the scripture plainly says. Yeshua is only high priest over the house of Yahweh. Now, continuing in this history, in verse 28, now in 1 Samuel, we see the tribes that Yahweh brought out of Egypt, and we see how they turned from Yahweh in a leadership of one family. Now, history says this family, the Korahites that sprang from Korah, they were pretty strong persuaders in their actions, and they had a lot of followers behind them. But Korah, the Levite, he was actually a Levite who conspired with Dathan and Abiram against Moshe. Korah was the son of Izhar, the brother of Amram, the father of Moshe. Did he get that? Korah was in the bloodline with Moshe. In fact, he was a cousin. So Korah was Moshe's cousin. It made him a cousin to these leaders, Moshe and Aaron. That's in Exodus 6:21 and also Numbers 16 verse 149. So make it live in your mind. So here you are Moshe, there's your brother Aaron, and here's your cousin Korah. Okay? So just kind of hold that image. Moshe, Aaron, and their cousin Korah. So let's continue the history here. But anyway, here comes the cousin. He was the one that conspired and said, are we not all holy? Well, you would think you would have grounds to say, well, after all, is he not your cousin? Are we not all holy? Well, these were also the ones that were carrying the Coptic religion and built the golden calf and so forth. Now, these were Moshe's cousins, built these things in the camp when Moshe was in the house of Yahweh studying, trying to get the lessons ready for these people. So keep that in mind and remember, let's look at Amos chapter 3 very, very quickly here. For Yahweh tells us very clearly that it's one family that he is dealing with. Of course, we know it's the 12 tribes, but you could see here dealing with the leadership of the house of Yahweh at that time, that it was within that family of Levi. So in Amos chapter 3, verse 1, it says, hear this word which Yahweh has spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family which I brought up from the land of Egypt, saying, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. You only have I known of all the families. So you could see that what is being portrayed here is still within that one family that Yahweh is dealing with. So you see, Moshe was preparing the lessons. Korah, his cousins, they rose up in rebellion against him. Now, Pastor says this took place secretly over a period of years. Remember, he led them in the wilderness there for 40 years. It wasn't like he went up there and 30 minutes later they were building a calf. This was done under conspiracy, and then finally they showed an open hand to Moshe, and Moshe fell on his face. So there was time. This was building over a period of time. 40 years is a long time. 40 years is a long time. So this was being done over a period of time. Verse 30, and that's when Yahweh, the death angel that he had already assigned to do this now, took their lives. In fact, the ground opened. The ground, the microorganisms in the earth opened, the earth, and swallowed up Korah and a few of his team, but not many. That few thousand it swallowed up were 250, I think it said. Then the plague killed several more. The next morning it said, but it didn't mean the next day when it describes the reason the plague came and killed others. It wasn't like the next morning, so it wasn't like tomorrow this event took place. It was the next period of time. It was the next time period when this was brought about because they were practicing evil. Now let me get this in your mind. They didn't turn to righteousness when Korah and 250 of his popular men in Israel were wiped out. Those were leaders, 250 leaders that he had following him. But you remember how many people were brought out of the land of Egypt? How many were following Moshe? You remember the estimate that Pastor gave us? Yeah. So this was 250 out of 3 million. That was just a drop in the bucket. So it wasn't everyone who were involved in the rebellion that was killed at that period of time. That was just a small portion of them that were wiped out. He had a lot more than that, but they were too scared to show up. And when the ground opened up and swallowed them, they accused Moshe. The whole camp of Israel then accused Moshe of killing Yahweh's people. Not that they didn't say, well, it was their own sins that brought this upon them. They accused Moshe of killing Yahweh's people. So their sins continued in following the golden calf, the bull, the great power, the Baal god worship that seems like a joyful, desirable thing as Satan told Eve. That's what they kept practicing, and finally came this plague. They brought a plague into the camp. But notice how Pastor is laying it out. He's showing that, you read in Exodus and you read in Numbers, and as he said, you'll read this took place one day, and then the next morning, here comes this plague. And Pastor is showing, no, it didn't take place the next day. It wasn't the next morning that this plague took place. It took over a period of time. But what caused the plague, as Pastor shows here, it was their practice of sin. The eating of the unclean food. It was the practice of fornication. As he shows here in verse 33, it says, to bring this plague, I brought out to you what you have got to have, death mixed with unclean foods, mixed with STDs. So over a period of time, when the children of Israel were practicing sin in the wilderness, they brought this plague upon themselves. Verse 34, but this plague they brought upon themselves. Yahweh didn't bring it. They brought it on themselves. So when you really start thinking about it, you'll see many of the tests and trials that they went through in the wilderness, it wasn't Yahweh doing it to them. They were bringing it upon themselves because of their sins. It wasn't Yahweh. It had nothing to do with Yahweh. They were bringing it upon themselves because of their sins, because of the choices that they were making that wasn't in accordance to the 613 laws of Yahweh. They were bringing these things upon themselves. Now that one killed thousands, speaking of this plague, and thousands of Israelites there, and that showed who Yahweh had chosen versus who had chosen the gods. So this taught the rest of Israel, or should have taught the rest of Israel, that Yahweh was in fact in complete control, and when he said, and what he said was going to take place and took place. His plan was from the beginning. From these 12 dishonorable tribes, God worshippers, his plan was to bring forth holy seed. If you remember, that's what the prophet said, to bring forth the holy seed, who he would appoint, who was Yahshua. Now that plague, that's in Numbers chapter 17, verses 41 through 50. The descendants of Korah afterwards, though became very popular, they took over the Levitical priesthood, and Yahweh allowed this to take place. And as we read in Yada, they call it Jude in the King James Version. In Yada 1:11, the world has gone the way of Cain and Korah. Korah is also mentioned there. So he goes to Yada chapter 1, verse 11 and verse 36, and in verse 10 we read, then verse 11 says, woe to them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, have run greedily in the error of Balaam for reward. Did you see the reward that they seek after in the news just now? And he's talking about the millions of dollars that is brought in by the Catholic Church and so forth. Let's look at verse 37. Have run greedily in the error of Balaam for reward. Now get this, because this is the same thing that we see taking place in the 7 hills of Rome today, and have perished, that is, judged worthy of perishing, in the rebellion of Korah. Now this rebellion, if you look into it in the book of Yada, you would see that, in the book of Yada, and you look in the King James Version, you'll see what is mentioned there is gainsaying, and basically it means to speak against. Korah, Moshe's cousin, was speaking against Moshe. And in that speaking against Moshe, they were able to stir up others speaking against Moshe. And it took time, of course, to build up the numbers that they did. But as we see, it was just a drop in the bucket that, as Pastor said previously. Now concerning Cain, he says, look at verse 39, he said, let's look at Genesis chapter 4. Because this is where it started. That is where we are told in no uncertain terms the cause of hatred and killing. Genesis 4, that word in verse 3, he says, and on one of Yahweh's Sabbaths it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to Yahweh. The fruit of the ground meaning earth, but other things too. Fruit of the ground means many other things besides just fruit of the ground. And to understand this, you have got to go to the foundation stone. That is going to be kind of lengthy, so I can't go into that today, Pastor says. And he said you have to get to the second part of the book of Yahweh. Further on, it wasn't talking about going out here and raising a crop or some vegetables and bringing some fruit to Yahweh. It's talking about people. It's actually talking about people. So this is the offering that Cain brought. It was people that he brought, but these were people of the fruit of the ground. And you know what Abel brought forward, as that has been covered so many times. In verse 41, Pastor says, let's cover one more scripture. Let's look at Yachanan chapter 3, verse 12. And in Yachanan 3:12, in verse 42 of the book of Israel, he says, if I have told you earthly things. See, he brought this offering from the earth. So was he talking about how to raise a garden here? No. If I told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? Well, this was also taking place in the days of Cain, and the history there that Yahweh wrote for us today for us to understand. And there's a great lesson behind this, and it tells you when salvation would be. Now get this. It tells you when salvation would be, and this is what Pastor says. The main salvation of the Holy Scriptures is the house of Yahweh today. And if you have the book of Israel, underline that because that's really essential to understanding. The main salvation of the Holy Scriptures, of the entire book of Yahweh, is the house of Yahweh today, in these last days, in this last time period, the house of Yahweh today, with Yahshua as high priest over the house of Yahweh, opposing Babylon that is still bringing forth the same thing that Cain brought, Korah brought, and the whole world has gone to today. This is what we see in the world. We see fighting and wars. We see sickness and disease. We see drought. When we get a rain, it's hail and high water. Verse 45, the same plagues get in the people's bodies in a certain mixture of these sins. The results of the sins are in the microorganisms, and they mutate together, and they're in the heavens now. And the same things that get into the body that cause a plague and are in the heavens right now causing a plague. Well, ordinarily, they die off and get dispersed, but that's not the case now. So he's showing that what's going on in the bodies of mankind, it's also going on in the heavens, it's going on in the seas, it's going on in the earth and so forth. Because of the sins keep multiplying the diseases, and that's why you're having earthquakes and tornadoes and floods and droughts and all the type of severe weather that we keep seeing week after week after week. Verse 46, and the firmament is trying to do its job. The microorganisms, they're trying to send rain in due season, but they can't manage their jobs properly like they were designed to do and commanded to do. But they're still trying to follow Yahweh's orders and bring rain and the amount of rain that we need so crops can grow and the land can grow and be fruitful and multiply. The trees can't bring forth healthy fruit anymore. We are told that from the county extension agents, and of course it shows the defilement of the land right there. And of course how everything has to be supplemented because of it's not in the land anymore. The strength is no longer in the earth because of mankind's sin. Verse 48, while the whole world is screwed up as Yahweh said it would be, and Yeshua said it's going to be the worst ever in Matthew 24. Until next week, may Yahweh bless your understanding. Praise Yahweh.